Welcome, everybody, to another edition of the Henry III Roundtable, talking about the events of the longest reign in English history until the modern era, that of Henry III. I'm Darren Baker, together with historians John Marshall, Michael Ray, and Huw Ridgeway. So, last time we were discussing the Sicilian business. This was Henry's attempt to acquire the throne of Sicily for his youngest son, Edmund. Uh, it it caused quite a bit of controversy then. It doesn't really cause much controversy today because most scholars and historians see it as another example of Henry's simplicity and why that one bit of foreign policy brought him to the year 1258, which is what we're going to discuss today, namely the Parliament where Henry, after about 25 years, gave up on his personal rule and ceded all authority to a baronial council, which, by the way, he was the lord of, for what that was worth in the end. So anyway, we're at 1258, and we should begin by talking about some of the background, like how we got to this point, because essentially 1258 is the culmination of everything that led up to it throughout the 1250s, not just the Sicilian business per se, but also we have sort of the crisis of Henry's finances. I mean, he was impoverished by the time 1258 rolls around, not just because of the Sicilian business, but factors of patronages and so forth. Also, there is inclement weather that has led to a famine, and this is causing more pressure on the reign. The year before was the attempt to drive back Welsh incursions, which ultimately failed. Now there seems to be some kind of rumblings in the Scottish Minority Council, a kind of alliance with Wales. And of course, there is the papacy demanding its money. So there's all these factors bearing down on Henry as 1258 rolls around. So does anybody want to give us some background? Namely, like the Parliament begins around the first week, or in the first week of April, and it already begins with the sort of bad guys of the piece, the Lusignans. So what's
We should
going on
probably,
with the Lusignans?
just as a background, just very quickly before that, we should talk about the oath that had just been taken by the nobles, which is probably the precursor to what's going to happen in the Parliament.
Yeah, sure. So start with that for us, John, please.
So basically, a bunch of the nobles, chief of which Simon de Montfort, of course, also Peter of Savoy, have signed this oath to stand together to bring good government to the realm. And basically, it's a one for all for one situation. And I think it's a precursor because basically all of these oath takers are going to be involved in what's about to happen in Parliament. So I think we just need to say that they've taken this oath before the Parliament begins.
No, actually, no. The date is after the Parliament began,
So
because the
April
sworn
17, isn't it? Yeah,
conspiracy.
it's just after. It's just after.
Yes, because Parliament opened, according to David Carpenter, on the 9th of April, and the
Yeah,
oath, yeah,
it's
the
it,
sworn
it's
conspiracy is
after
the 12th, isn't it?
it's after Parliament, but before the great sort of
Yes,
march into
yes,
Parliament. Yeah.
yes. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the only thing that my only comments about that is that, of course, there's only one text of the oath, the sworn conspiracy, and that is, of course, lodged in the Montfort archives. Now, David Carpenter argues that that is proof positive that the force behind the compact was Simon de Montfort. Um, I mean, it's impossible to say, but I would argue that because uh, I mean, other members of that conspiracy or that group had archives, And I find it almost impossible that Peter of Savoy wouldn't have had a copy of that
Yeah.
compact. Now you may say, well, you've just published an article about Peter of Savoy's archives, which of course does not include that. But there are other very important documents that Peter of Savoy had, which were not copied onto that roll. So it is just likely, isn't it, that document might have been suppressed because it wasn't really sort of relevant to the purpose of that document roll, which was, of course, much later on, involved the confiscation of Peter's estates and reallocation of Peter's estates, wasn't it? So I think that I think it's a bit of an assumption on David's part to say that just because that is in the Montfort archives, therefore Montfort was the instigator and the leader of that compact.
No, yeah, I totally agree because here you have the Earl of Norfolk, who was senior to Simon. You have Richard de Clare, the Earl of Gloucester, who was
Yes,
far richer
yes,
than Simon.
yes,
So it does
yes,
seem unlikely that he definitely had the most grievances of the group.
yes.
But
But I'm sure that, you presumably there must have been, I forget how many people are in the compact now, but
yeah,
you'd
there
have
were
eight
seven.
copies, seven copies. Well, there you go. Seven copies must have been made
No,
of
no,
it.
there were seven members, and I think maybe David relies a little bit on the fact that Peter de Montfort is in that group because he's kind of a second tier baron. He's really not sort of the same, let's say, level as the others, and
Yes, I could
he
see
was
that.
definitely an
Yes,
ally of
yes.
Simon's.
Mm, mm.
So perhaps Simon brings Peter in and says, "Hey, everyone, I've already I've already got one member for us. How about?" But they all definitely had grievances against the Lusignans. So
Yes,
what
yes.
was the precursor? Like what did these four brothers do now that upset everybody?
Well, I think certainly as far as the Savoy Isle was concerned, I mean, that's actually just also worth bearing in mind that a lot of the chroniclers, when they talk about 1258 after the event, they imagine that the whole thing is anti-foreigner, and it is more, as has been said quite well by most of the people here, it's more anti-Lusignan than it is anti-foreigner per se. But what you've got is Edward going into the Lusignan camp, or perceived to be going into the Lusignan camp, which of course made Eleanor and therefore Peter nervous of their loss of control of Edward. So that's certainly a factor.
Right,
Yeah.
and Hugh, isn't it true that this drift of Edward towards the Lusignan that was only very recent, right?
Well, it appears to be, yes. I mean, it was only really round about the spring of 1258, I think, that Edward finally settled any of his disputes with Guy and I think it was Geoffrey de Lusignan. Um, Edward had had a running dispute over land which had been allocated to Geoffrey in Ireland, which of course annoyed Edward because it cut into his appanage in Ireland. I think they reached a deal in the
Mm-hmm.
spring of 1258, um, and um, and the Lusignans began to witness his charters, I think, round about the same period. So it was a really recent rapprochement, um, and um,
And
uh,
also
and that must have really.
he's mortgaging his properties
Mm-hmm.
to
Well, that's right. Yes, yes. He began to make various financial deals with them at that stage too. Yes, and also, of course, um, well, we don't know exactly when the appointments were made, but he made Geoffrey de Lusignan seneschal of Gascony, and made over the Isle of Oléron to Guy de Lusignan. Um, uh, well, certainly this we know of these appointments by July 1258,
yeah.
but I dare say they weren't made that long before then.
Right.
Um,
So there you have, here is Edward, heir to the throne. Everybody wants to be his friend, and suddenly
yes,
he's breaking away from that
yes,
Savoyard control for so many years, and he's
that's
going
right.
not just to another camp, but the camp of the Queen's enemies, because
Yes, yes,
she
yes.
dislikes, especially Aymer de Lusignan,
Yes.
the Bishop-elect of
Yes.
Winchester, for reasons we really don't know today.
Yes. Well, in some ways, this goes back to this issue of Henry's finances, doesn't it? Because I mean, justification, one of the justifications of it was that these people had cash available to assist in Edward's campaigns in Wales. Of course, he'd made a lot of losses against Llywelyn in the 1256 to period onwards. Um, and the again, there's a big problem with Henry III's finances, in that some people argue that he wasn't bankrupt in 1258. Um, it's very, very difficult to work out the exact state of royal finances, partly because you have this division between the exchequer and the wardrobe. But I think there are some signs that Henry was may not be insolvent in 1258, but he was working on such a narrow margin
Mm.
that that he couldn't really take on any additional strains, such as, say, a campaign in Wales, without some form of extra assistance.
Right.
And some people then argue that his finances were so bad because he'd given so much cash and patronage to the Lusignans, I mean, even Edward as well, for that matter, and therefore things had started to go wrong with the finances. So the Lusignans basically had, particularly Aymer, the Elect of Winchester, who were very effective estate managers. They'd got cash reserves. We're talking perhaps, I don't know how much they would have had, but let's
Well,
imagine
they
could
were
have had, say,
allowed.
£5,000 or something like that,
No,
perhaps even bigger sums,
yeah, they
in
were
deposit.
allowed. They were allowed to leave with at least 6,000, so they probably had even more.
Yes,
But
yes, yes. Well,
but
that's an
to your
interesting point, you see.
but to your point about the finances, I think it's very correct, because if we go back a year, in 1257, there was that famous council meeting in Windsor, where it was quite clear that Henry, his household, he just had no more money. He couldn't even afford his household anymore, and there was the fear that he would have to give away parts of the royal domain just in order to stay solvent. So they all took that oath. They were going to help the
Well,
king.
the demean issue is nothing to do with. I don't think that's, well, I don't know. I suppose he could have farmed it out, I suppose. Um, but I think the demean was more to do with competition over land grants, which doubtless will come to in due course. But you're right. Yes, there was that ordinance for the household finances, and that does suggest that councillors close to the king were getting concerned about issues of control. And I think even then, under that ordinance, it's something along the lines of trying to bring it more under exchequer control. I think
Right.
certainly the exchequer was supposed to sort of build up the fund and then give it to the wardrobe.
Right.
Um,
Like if
and
Henry walked in the exchequer and said, "Write me a check for they were supposed to say, "Sorry, my lord, we
well,
can't
no,
do that."
well, you see, the problem is that funds were being diverted from the exchequer to the wardrobe and taken at source by Henry. Um, and this was creating, I dare say, a lot of confusion over accounting and trying to work out exactly where the king's finances, how they were sort of totting up. And I
Right.
think that this was creating this kind of unease amongst councillors, clearly,
Sure.
even in the middle
Okay.
of
So
twelve-fifty-seven.
we have the state of that Henry. He's basically on the verge of impoverishment, we might say. So,
Well,
but there,
it's more that he can't afford
right,
anything too much,
right.
Else
more
to go
than just
wrong, yeah.
But
basically to exist.
but but
Yes.
what but what we, what when this parliament is summoned, clearly they have all this stuff they have to deal with, as I mentioned before, the famine, Wales, Scotland, and so forth, and Sicily. So, and basically, Henry, it all really comes down to money, which is why he's there. But as we mentioned at the outset, there are these 7 nobles who have a grievance against the Lusignans. So, and that started right on the cusp of this parliament meeting, which was namely Aymer got into a fracas with who was it? John Fitzgeoffrey.
That's the chair, isn't it, in Surrey?
Yeah, that's it.
Susan Stewart has written about that.
Right. And this was a huge brawl because later on, I think as many as 60 of Aymer's men received pardons for that brawl. So he had at least 60 men attacking this this prior and his clerks there, and essentially, according to Matthew Paris, John Fitzgeoffrey complained about it to Henry. Henry said, "All right, let's wait till after the Parliament. Let's not make a big deal about it right now." So this was sort of the impetus for this confederation coming together, secret confederation. We should emphasize there. So we go through the Parliament now. Important is that the clergymen all leave quite suddenly. The Tewkesbury Annalist, he says that they were afraid of the king, and maybe they were afraid that they would have to pay up as well. In any event, the Parliament comes to an end around April 30th, and Henry makes his request for Sicily again. He wants his nobles to ask the laity if they will contribute an aid to it. And this is where we come to that fork in the road, essentially. Did Henry willingly agree to enact reforms in return for this aid, or was he forced to do it? So the background to that, again, comes from Tewkesbury, who writes a very, well, let's say, full account of the barons putting on their armor and marching into possibly Westminster Hall and say, "Where's the king?" You know, and the doormen sort of say, "Oh, look, you can come in, but you have to leave your weapons at the door." Yeah. So, does anybody want to take over from there? What ensues? Because
we have that famous line from Henry, of course, "Am I your prisoner?"
Right. Well, we actually because Westminster Palace was quite extensive. Then we don't know where this confrontation took place. I doubt if it happened in his chamber. I don't know, but
I mean, for what it's worth, of course, it's the account that you have is, well, it looks like a piece of like a propaganda letter, doesn't it? It's not a you know, it's got spin on it. It's like something that Trump would have written, you know. It's not a literal account of what happened. I mean, it's because you know, there are 2 features in it, isn't it? First of all, Roger Bigott demands that all aliens go. I think I'm right. And secondly, there's some sort of mention of a biblical quote or something, quotation in there, both of which look as though the account has been written up.
well, I have here Charles Beaumont's biography of Simon de Montfort. It's the English edition from 1930, and he actually provides a full translation of this account, which I can read a bit here because it's quite interesting, actually, how he goes into details. So he says, "On the day agreed upon, as the 3rd hour approached, which would be about 9 a.m., the noble and brave men, the earls, barons, and knights came to court. that is to Westminster, in great array, their swords by their sides. At the entrance of the royal chamber, they laid down their weapons, and when they appeared before the king, saluted him with reverence that was due to him. At the threatening aspect of the barons in their complete suits of mail, the king was seized with sudden terror. "What is this, sirs?" he said. "Am I your prisoner?" "No, sir," replied Roger Bigod. "No, but the miserable, insufferable Pontavons, as well as all aliens, must be banished from your presence and ours. This is our secret." Well, he goes on, and Henry makes one more reply. He says, "And how see you that I shall follow your counsels?" And they say, "Swear with your hand on the Gospels, you and your son Edward, that you will seek the advice of 24 good men." It all sounds rather too poetic for...
So that thing there really is all aliens that Bigod is supposed to have said. And look, certainly Carpenter thing. I don't know what you think about this, Huw, that we think that Peter of Savoy may have been standing alongside him. Is he likely to have said that with Peter of Savoy standing next to him?
We just don't know. We
It does
just
sound
don't
like
know.
it does sound like spin, doesn't
I
it?
think. I mean, there's obviously some documentary evidence that Peter was at court, and that's about as much as we can say.
We can't
I
tell
mean,
anymore.
I think this Carpenter takes the view that Peter of Savoy was somehow or other dragged along in the events of 1258, which he subsequently came to regret. My own view is, and of course, then you also have whole doles of Carpenter says that the 1258 revolution was driven by anti-alien sentiment. Well, there isn't really the sort of direct evidence that really supports that completely, actually. And as you say, they must have been able to make a distinction between Savoyards and Poitevins, for instance. And
the Waverley analyst is making that distinction too. Yes, the chronicler at Waverley.
Yes, which is oddly enough one of the chronicles which was written up after much after the event, because this is the problem, you see, with the chronicles. You can't take the chronicles as statements of fact. Very few of them actually give a really clear account anyway of 1258, and so many of them were written with the benefit of hindsight, with rather obvious anti-alien sort of if you like, tropes and stereotypes. And again, you've got to watch, you've got to look at all the documents that emerge, because you have to ask yourself, to what extent is this a document, or to what extent is it, if you like, a persuasive piece of writing, i.e. some sort of propaganda, we might say.
But there is in the documents of Baronial Reform.
Yeah, well, the revolution was dressed as no doubt, certainly by the Oxford Parliament, which is a bit later on, as a sort of a liberation of the realm from wicked foreigners. But whether again, it wasn't as simply an anti-alien explosion. It was certainly something quite controlled, wasn't it?
Not at that point, yeah. I think it certainly developed as time goes on, and for the next 5 years thereafter.
Yes, it becomes that way.
It certainly becomes that, and therefore they kind of, when they're writing after the event, they're transposing the events back to say, well, this is of course where it starts.
Yes. There's a world of difference between the politics of 1263 or 1264 and that of 1258. I mean, I've always argued that what happened in 1258 fueled what then happened in 1263.
I'm sure we all have, the documents of the Baronial.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, that book. It has this very famous letter that was written by a member of the court. It doesn't identify who, and he has written a letter to someone explaining what had happened during the later Parliament at Oxford. But what is interesting is that he explains how the Lusignans were more or less targeted, they were expelled, and he goes into all that. But towards the end, he says, the Lord King has often begged them, the barons, that none but Englishmen shall stay around him, and so it will be. So he's writing in July, and supposedly the Lord King has often begged them that even before these events of 1258, he's making the claim that Henry is asking his barons, can you help me get rid of these foreigners? Now,
Right. Darren, can I ask you this question? Do you think that is a statement of fact, or is it a piece of propaganda, that letter?
well, that has been to the next point, which has been used by historians to suggest that maybe Henry was trying to get back at Peter of Savoy for more
Yes,
or less,
I
moving against the
wouldn't.
Lusignans.
Yes, yeah. I'm afraid I found another. I found I mean, I published a newsletter, a similar kind of newsletter from 1261. I mean, these newsletters were being sent out, and they're influencers, aren't they? But they're not worth more than, in a sense, although it's got a lot of detail in it, and I don't decry that. And of course, it may, you can sort of tie the detail in with dates, although the sequence of events is slightly wrong in that letter. Nevertheless, the letter is a piece of propaganda. It's intended to influence, and of course, it's copied into the Burton Annals with quite a lot of other material as well. So I mean, it's interesting that the baronial council at that stage were still interesting. Well, they were interested in framing the whole revolution as an anti-alien thing.
Well, but here's a good question. So was 1258, it's often referred to as a revolution, but can we
Yes,
say, was it revolutionary, but not necessarily a revolution? Because
right.
this comes to the point where if we assume that the chroniclers are all, how shall we say, spreading fake news or trying to influence public opinion or whatever, that
Right.
we have the official record which shows Henry's cooperation. He wants this to go forward. And we see in the later grievances of 1261, we see in the appeal to Louis in 1264 that all agree that Henry was fully on board. He freely made his promise to them and so forth. So if we go from that sentiment, why would Henry want to basically turn over all power to his barons?
Okay.
What does he get out of it?
I think that what happened in 1258, you have two events, though, two stages, don't you? I mean, you have um, the deal struck and announced by Henry on the 2nd of May, whereby you have a council of 24, half of whom are nominated supposedly by the king and half by the community of the realm. And they are supposed to draw up a set of reforms. However, and the deal there was that they would settle the king's debts, that they would settle issues to do with complaints about royal patronage, that they would request an aid to sort the problems arising from the king's relationship with the papacy, provided that is that the king could get the amelioration of the terms, and of course also that the king's war with Wales would continue, because after in the period between that and the provisions of Oxford, you have a series of writs which were going to inaugurate an extremely elaborate military operation against Llywelyn, which was only called off, by the way, at the last possible minute, around about the end of June.
You have those Burgundian
So
Knights coming,
you've
Huw,
got that. Now, I think that might have been a compromise because, you know, and if you look at the way in which the Lusignans, for example, or at least two of them, I think, were sent off on the delegation to accept the draft terms of the Treaty of Paris, that all points to some sort of compromise. And I fully accept that that might have been the case, but it all went wrong.
Well,
And
but
it all went wrong, and it went wrong in the Parliament at Oxford. Now, whether it was sincerely intended as a compromise, a little bit along the lines of course, current discussions being had about the truce in Ukraine, is another point we just don't know. But it all went wrong. Whether it couldn't have worked, I don't know. I mean, Henry's group on the 24, of course, he didn't quite manage 12 people. He was so isolated. He managed only 11 names are known.
I don't know if that's so true. It's often pointed out that Henry is isolated. Like you know, this was the famous statement of Howick that Henry, you know, he's more or less like Hubert de Burgh before him. He's isolated from his people. I would suggest that his 12 could have easily mustered enough support amongst their lordship as the barons could have. But the turning point here was more or less who's on whose side. And we have this famous command to Richard de Clare and we see him more or less switching sides. Like in the middle.
Yes.
So you can see when we have this parliament, we see all this deal making going on here.
Yes. Well, yes, you're right, and he is named on the King's, at least on one version, I think, is it, of the King's 12.
Yeah, it's in the patent rolls, but all historians have said no, that was a mistake. The clerk made a mistake. Well, I don't really buy that.
Well, yes, I think there's some sort of, you know, as I say, confusion. As I say, but on then I think I'm right in saying is Earl of Gloucester on another text.
Well, he's listed in the
baronial
Burton
12.
Annals as part of the baronial 12.
Yes, I know that, and of course there is this point that, you know, Gloucester may have changed his allegiance, and there's this idea, isn't it, that he'd been somehow or other seduced over to the the Savoyard side by the Queen as a result of various deals in the course of 1257.
Right.
That's quite possible,
starting
really.
with the Welsh campaign.
Yes.
The Queen is more or less, you know, drawing him away.
Yes.
A marriage for his daughter.
Well, of course, factionally, the Earl of Gloucester, it does sound as, I mean, he does seem to have disputes with Aymer, the Elect of Winchester, it's I wrote, you know, in an article I wrote, I could see, you know, see them as some sort of rivals in Dorset, and also of course he'd got these rivalry with the long-standing rivalry with the Lord Edward. So it is possible that this is all some sort of I don't know, I think it's likely there's some sort of factional division going on there.
Let's put it together with what we have now. So let's say that there was this this deadly encounter between Fitzgeoffrey and the Lusignans. This led to Simon de Montfort, the earls, and all coming together in a secret confederation.
We're forgetting just one little piece of evidence. And sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but you do realize that the first actions of the 24, just after the 2nd of May.
Yeah, it's very famous.
On the 4th of May, you've got a patent which says that the 24 promise to settle Simon de Montfort's
Exactly.
outstanding land territorial claims, and this settlement was supposed to be announced at the Parliament at Oxford. Now, I think that really is perhaps one of the explanations, anyway, why things, of course, broke down, and led to the breach with the Lusignans. Though, I mean, I could well believe that perhaps in reality they were already marked men by that stage.
Right.
Um,
So if we look at behind the scenes, so there we have the Queen with Peter of Savoy definitely wanting to get rid of, or if not get rid of them, at least attenuate their power or their influence at court
Yeah.
somehow. So this brings us to the actual Parliament in Oxford. Everything is running along to 24. And we should stress that it's not just the 24. We've got clerks, judges. It's a little bit like the Parliament at Merton 30 years before when they were drawing up legislation. It's just not about a group of barons. It's a whole swath of society with their inputs. And we also had the petition that was circulating at that time, what the knights and the freeholders would like to see come out of these
Yes,
reforms.
but you know that the petitions of the barons, that's been worked over by Paul Brown, don't you? And looking at various um, drafts of it and texts of it, he suggests that it was a negotiated document. In
Yeah.
other words, it might well have been doctored in order to make various propaganda points. And make it more anti-alien than in various ways. So again, even the petition of the barons, I'm not sure whether it's actually a statement of grievances or a sort of how do I put it? An inflammatory statement of grievances
But yeah,
designed.
this is what I would put forward. So as we are in this parliament and these deals are going on and so forth, and sides are trying to intimidate each other, here we have that famous order on the 22nd of June that that Henry gives permission the 24th to proceed to the election of the Council of 15. And this was very important that the barons chose on the royalist side Mansell and the Earl of Warwick, two of the Queen's steadfast supporters. And they, together with the two Bigot brothers, choose a council that completely excludes the Lusignans. So this was probably the signal that
Yes, could be.
that the move against the Lusignans was taking place. Of course, they resist. Simon has his famous statement, William, give up your castles or give up your head, or something to that effect.
Yeah.
But essentially, this idea of restoring the king's properties, his castles, the wardships, escheats, everything, this idea was to alleviate the king's impoverishment, and the easiest way to find that money was to disenfranchise these aliens. And I often have to wonder to myself, I mean, we see the Queen's hand there, of course, but I really have to wonder, is Henry himself behind all this? Because, I mean, these are his brothers, whatever, but in my mind, Henry's absolute priority is his crusade and Sicily, which we could sort of throw together there. Because there's that one very important statement in the provisions of Oxford where they they take back the castles from the aliens, let's say, and they give them to these Castellans who are nominated by the council, and they are to hold them for 12 years. That these Castellans answer only to the council for 12 years. Why 12 years? That's quite a long time.
Yeah, well,
And I have to think this is Henry, preparing for his crusade, preparing for Sicily. Who knows how long he's going to be overseas. So,
well, Darren, the 12-year period, that's always traditionally seen as actually something rather sort of sinister, isn't it? Because you know, not only is it likely to mean that Henry would never control these castles for the rest of his life, but also possibly Edward in this earlier on in his reign would be also hamstrung.
Well, David makes that argument that Henry would
Yes.
never rule again unfettered. I don't buy that, because, as we all know, you don't die because of age. You die because of the good Lord. He's the one who decides when it's your time to
Well,
come.
yes, I
But
suppose
I
so.
think Henry is looking at Louis's crusade, the time
Yes.
of preparation, the execution, the time he spent. This was quite a long time. And of course, the number 12 has a lot of religious significance.
Well,
The 12
I think
apostles, the 12 days of Christmas, and so forth.
yeah, this is also part of a bigger argument, really, which is to what extent were the the men of 1258 idealists, and to what extent were they just driven by faction. Now, in the case of Peter of Savoy, I think it's a bit it's not right to say that Peter was purely driven by faction. Peter was interested, I think, in standards of government. I mean, you can see this with his his stance over the royal demesne and the interests of the crown. And of course, he kept in his archive documents which were part of his earlier battles to make sure that Henry stuck to an appanage for the Lord Edward. He contained also documents which would mean that the king would stick to his earmarking of certain lands for the dower of the Queen, and he also took his oath seriously that he'd made in 1257, that he would not consent to alienations from the ancient demesne of the crown. So I think Peter was, may well been one of those councillors who thought that 1258 was a good thing, because Henry somehow, his judgment, particularly vis-a-vis the Lusignans, was now proving to be wanting, and therefore it was in the king's best interests that reform should happen.
Huw, backing up,
that
what you're saying there is the very first thing he did when he became Count of Savoy, of course, was to reform the government. And it was
he
to
did
reform the
indeed,
government.
yes, absolutely. Well done. Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So that's obviously how seriously he took it. That's what he's
Yes.
known for, is governance.
Yes, and reform is something which is not necessarily inimical to royal dignity. Yes, you're absolutely right. Yes.
Right, but
something I'd like to mention is that you just pass on the Earl of Warwick as if he's nobody. The Earl of Warwick is an alien.
Yes.
He retains the constableship of Devizes and keeps him very well with both sides. David Cotter once said he must have been a really nice man, because he gets away with a forced marriage to the Countess of Warwick, and he survives very well. two heiress marriages, and heiress marriages for his children as well.
Yes.
And not only him, but Imbert Puges, who is a Savoyard, he doesn't lose his he does lose his constableship at the Tower of London, but as a sort of sop to him, his stepson is given that of Oxford. So it isn't totally black and white.
No, it isn't.
No, but I would agree that Peter would definitely have a greater interest in the mechanics of government, let's say, than the English barons. But also, to my point, is Henry, he wants this crusade to happen. I mean, we see throughout the rest of his life, on the eve of the Battle of Lewes, after Edward departs on crusade, he's constantly talking about fulfilling his crusade vow.
Yes.
I think that's top of his priorities, and he knows he's got to get this realm in order.
Well, I think that's all, again, part of it. I think, and also the other thing I was going to say was that when you mentioned the method of election of the council, that I always I remembered something my old supervisor, Barbara Harvey, who was a great expert on the monks of Westminster, told me. She said, "Oh, by the way," she said, "the election of the council reminds me of the method whereby they used to organize elections of abbots in the that you had you appointed a special committee that did the appointing, and the other thing that strikes me that's interesting is that um, uh, the constitution of the Dominican order, which is a 13th century document, that was also very interested in a provision of counselors so that the superior person wouldn't have unfettered control, but would have various people who were designed to make sure that his control was in some way mediated in some way. And all I'm trying to say is that I think that there were real interest people, intellectuals who were asking about power and good governments, and and somebody like Peter of Savoy, and Montfort for that matter, might well have been interested in that sort of thing. Well, of course, there'd been that famous tract, wasn't there, against tyrants, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The gross test.
Gross test, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, all this sort of plays in these various factors to that extent. I just wonder if perhaps they all have, there's this self-motivation in there, because here, and this is my point with Henry again and his impoverishment, that they need to find money somehow. And when you banish the Lusignans, you open up this very rich lordship of Winchester, and they more or less just help themselves to those revenues. And I
Yes.
have to think that Henry is looking back to those 7 years when he
Yes.
held Winchester in his argument with William Raleigh, and 20,000 pounds of revenue flowing into the crown every, I don't know if it was 20, no, maybe 4, 5, 6,000 a
Mhm.
year was flowing
Well,
into the crown. And I'm
yes,
wondering if Henry is thinking, because he's had run-ins before with Eimer, we know that. I mean, Paris himself documents them. So if he's
well,
thinking Eimer is banished, the Queen wants it, then there's all this money
yes. Well, the
available.
treatment of Winchester, of course, as a vacancy, that definitely provides a huge extra cash injection, on top of including Aymer's treasure, because Aymer left treasury behind him. He inherited Winchester, where the previous bishop had gone into debt. But he actually was. It seems to me that there's evidence that he was very effective in estate management. He managed to turn Winchester, into profit, which was probably not that difficult given the fact that it was a huge estate. But anyway, so he ran it very, very well. And the other Lusignans did leave treasury behind them. There is one very remarkable aspect, though, of the exiling of the Lusignans, and that is that their estates weren't confiscated. Um, they were kept what's the word? They were kept in
Like
store
escrow
for
or
them.
something.
Yes, and so that lest they might return, and I think that is a very, very
Well,
unusual.
I know, and
Um,
I think that again is Henry's hand there. Also, the fact that we know he issued safe conducts for the
yes,
Lusignans to appear in court to answer charges against them, and he issued it in Winchester. So there was
yes,
always this plan to move to Winchester. It wasn't like they suddenly flee there. Oh, let's everybody go to Winchester. I mean, this was going to happen anyway. But one thing I want to say now before I lose the thread is about this idea of elections, because there was that famous statement. I think maybe it was in the grievances Henry had against the council in 1261, where he complained that the council was uh, he would nominate somebody for one of the ministries, whether the chancellor, the treasurer, or whatever, and the council would go against him. they would nominate, they would name their own person. And in the grievances, they explained that they would choose 5 members of the council, and this subcommittee alone, they would decide who would fill the position. And when Henry would ask, well, how did you come to that decision? They would say it was all in secret. They're not allowed to tell him that they need absolution from
This
Boniface
is
or
all to
somebody.
do.
So
Yeah,
it's
this is
really
all to,
quite remarkable
yeah.
that these barons would not even tell their Lord King
No.
how they came around to nominate or to filling these ministerial positions.
Yeah. Well, I don't know whether that was general practice or whether this is, I mean, this is a specific reference to Henry's objection to Huw Ridgeway, who was appointed as justiciar in October 1260. But whether it was general practice or not, it's an interesting point, though, what you say. Yes. I mean, I don't know.
Well, it gives this idea of this, a lot of secrecy is going on here, because that was another of Henry's complaints, that they're meeting without him, they're making these little quiet discussions in a corner or so forth.
Yes. Well, as I say, there had been quite a sort of a change, political change in October 1260. As you know, it's dominated by, Montfort is much more important by that stage, and a lot of his henchmen get into office at that stage, and so it may be that the king's grievances were coloured by recent events rather than general practice that had operated since 1258. I don't know really. That is the point, though.
So here's another point to this idea of enacting reforms and therefore going into partnership with the barons, is we can assume that the queen is behind the scenes. She wants to get rid of her rivals, her enemies, the Lusignans. That much is true. But where again does Sicily fall in all this? Because we know that the barons said, all right, if you allow us to help you reform the realm, we will try to work on the laity to get you a subsidy for Sicily. Because I would assume that this is also still Eleanor's game as well, that she wants Sicily for her son Edmund, of course, and that Peter of Savoy and Boniface of Savoy would have been on board for that. What do you think?
Well, perhaps not. We have to remember in 1258, I can't remember the precise month, I think it's the middle of 1258, is Manfred, of course, is crowned King of Sicily. He's now conquered Sicily, and he's married to a Savoyard. So that's going to influence things, perhaps.
Well, but he crowned himself. I mean,
but he's now in possession. He's now so if you want to become King of Sicily, you've now got to completely unseat him. Yeah.
David makes the mention that the barons never had any intention of following through with their promise, that they were just paying him lip service. I think really can't believe that's true, because again, we're not just talking about Henry here. The court, of course, there is all this factionalism, but there had to have been quite a few people who believed in this, not just Sicily, but the King's Crusade. So
well, I mean, Henry, of course, the Crusaders, that's certainly still on the cards. I mean, Henry never muted his Crusader
right, and we shouldn't forget that Simon de Montfort took a vow.
No, and Peter of Savoy as well. They were all
right.
Crusade, and I think the Queen as well. Actually, she may.
According to Waverley,
But I mean, I totally agree that the reform of the realm, the idea of reform of the realm, it's imitating Louis IX in France as a precursor, as a precondition of going on crusade.
Definitely.
I totally agree about that.
Well,
and of course, the Treaty of Paris was linked with that, wasn't it, intimately, with the provision of the knights for 2 years that Louis IX was going to, and that was in the text, which was first announced on the 28th of May. I don't know when the actual first draft was ever produced. And presumably, some sort of draft must have been there for the king to have accepted it. So presumably,
Yeah,
that was
you're
there,
right. I
wasn't it?
mean, again, this is another of the factors playing into this parliament,
Yes,
is that
yes,
this Treaty of Paris is not just going to bring peace between these two kingdoms.
no,
Yeah.
And Henry is saying, okay, I'm finished with our ancestral lands on the continent. We're going to shift our focus to Southern Europe, but also this very important provision that Louis will provide money for an army of 1,000 knights for a year, which would form an excellent core for whatever army. And because he has peace with France, he, presumably he would march across Louis' territory to get there. And so I would imagine the Savoyards would definitely be on board. And of course they were for the peace treaty. And so
so
forth,
yes,
but
yes,
there was
yes.
just only one person who was still disgruntled about everything, and he was not going to let anything go forward. So.
Well, of course, he'd already the renunciation clauses then were already there, weren't they? Presumably by the
Right,
28th.
they were already there
May.
in May,
Yeah.
I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
But Henry had no
20.
reason to believe that Eleanor would not renounce. I mean, this is sort of shifty Simon again at work here.
Yes. Well, I think that the big problem is that if Montfort thought that exiling the aliens was going to pave the way to a grand territorial settlement, of course, it didn't work out that way.
Right. They did not
Because
confiscate those estates, as you were
they
saying.
did not confiscate the Lusignans' lands. And this, of course, then raised the issue of whether the king could find sufficient lands to endow Montfort and his family.
Yeah, because the way I see it is that when William de Valence was exiled, so the question become how much treasure he was taking with him, and there were all these ideas that his wife Joan was smuggling the treasure out. She eventually joined him overseas. So I'm thinking that Simon is somehow working behind there to get rid of Joan as well, to confiscate large swaths of Pembrokeshire, to make up this 400-pound annual fee, the swap for land, because Eleanor always claimed land from Pembrokeshire because she was the former Countess of.
But you do realize that the De Clares also had a claim over Pembroke as well.
Yeah. And Roger Bigod.
Yes. So I'm not sure whether, I think it's possible that, again, they had to pause about confiscating Lusignan lands to prevent a sort of a breakout of civil war amongst the baronial councillors. But it was a problem, and of course it was one of the reasons why the baronial council, of course, fell apart, because they could never really resolve it.
Well, you have Roger Bigod and Richard de Clare. They are grandsons of the marshals, and they would have to disgorge territory in order to satisfy the Montfort claims. So my thinking was that confiscating Pembroke would sort of cutting it up to satisfy everybody would have sort of satisfied all claimants. Why that didn't happen, I have to think maybe Henry and whoever's behind him simply would not allow it to happen, much like they would not allow the barons to depose Aymer as bishop-elect. He said, you're not going to do it. So I think Henry still has real power through all of this, though.
Well, no, I mean, the main reason why they couldn't depose Aymer was the papal support because he was a bishop elect, and you can't
Well, that didn't
be a
stop
bishop
them from
elect
trying.
without papal permission.
Well, it didn't stop them from trying, though. So,
Well, they did, yes, but that meant that you had to get round the papal curia, and it
well,
was more awkward.
Simon got his dispensation to Mary Eleanor. I mean, there's all kinds of ways of getting around the papal curia, but
Yeah, well,
well,
but it's a bit of a lottery, I think. That was the trouble with it. And Aymer did have a certain amount of support in Winchester as well. As you can see that amongst his officials who didn't.
well, I think didn't Richard de Clare make a move on some of the land that belonged to the Winchester estate, like right after Aymer's banishment?
Well, yes, well, certainly Richard was granted Weymouth and Portland by the
I believe the council ordered him to return it or something to that effect in late autumn.
Well, no, they never did, but they and I don't think they ever really disgorged it, even after Aymer died, until technically it had been restored to the in Aymer's will to the to St Swithun's, but it never was, I don't think.
I think it takes away some of the shine off this idealism of the barons wanting to make good, the realm and work for the people and so forth. I think Clare and Montfort are looking to themselves first and foremost, what they're going to get out of this reform.
Well, I think, yeah. I mean, as I say, people have written quite a bit about, the sort of combination of Montfort's idealism and self-interest, but you can see that the same thing with a number of other people. Yes, I don't know really. I suppose what they thought, if this was a quest for justice, then I suppose they felt a little justice should be shown to them as well.
Anyway, thanks for coming along again for this great ride, and we'll see you again.
Thank you, Darren, and lovely to see you all, and all the best. By the way, Michael, it's lovely to see you. You take care now.
Yeah.
Bye-bye now,
Michael. Jonty, see you guys.
Thank you.
Enjoy. Okay.
Bye now. Bye, Jonty. Bye bye.